We live in an age of abundance, an age of fast cars, airplanes, life-saving drugs, the internet, smartphones, and so much more. All of which was promised by capitalism and the free markets, all of which delivered. But far from our soft and cozy couches lies an underbelly of rampant exploitation, abject poverty, and a dying natural ecosystem. Oh, and don't you forget the rising sauna that we call Earth. So today, let's shed some light on the dark side of capitalism with Praveen Singh, a faculty member at the Sambhaavnaa Institute of Public Policy and Politics, located in the beautiful landscapes of Himachal Pradesh. Sit back and relax, because this one's gonna make you think. So, crucial part of anyone's journey is their origin story.
Mm-hmm.
What was your upbringing like? What was your childhood, your college life like?
So I grew up mostly in Delhi. My father was in the government services and my mother kind of brought us up. What would seem today like a very normal childhood, but if I look back, I think it was a fairly privileged childhood in the sense that we got to go to good schools where teachers actually taught and stuff. So in the 70s and 80s, I think that was a big thing to have, given that perhaps more than 90% of the country wasn't going to decent schools. I guess I was an okay student. So if you're an okay student in those days, you ended up taking science. I took science. I took the IIT exam and I got in, not with too much thought. I guess some of these things happen by default. IIT was a great time in terms of extracurricular activities, sports, made lots of friends for life. Certainly not interesting academically for me. I mean, I didn't enjoy the acads there. Perhaps IIT killed all possibilities of wanting to study any of those things further in me. So I landed up in a job in Bangalore. This was the software industry in the early 90s in India. And somehow I found the work quite boring. Actually, we were working for some client in Indonesia or Singapore, doing some maintenance of large mainframe systems. But that aside, I think apart from the immediate boredom of the work, I think for me, surprisingly, some questions started popping up very early. I mean, for me, the question was, I mean, one has been to a good college or something and one's life is likely to be very comfortable. But what about the rest of the society? I mean, do we have any role towards larger society? And when I used to look at the lives of people who are 10 years, 20 years senior to me in the organization, nothing about it enthused me. So it was all this, I mean, what one can now look back and say some kind of existential questions kind of started for me then. There were 4 of us staying together, 4 bachelors in a place, and 2 of them wanted to take the MBA exam. So I think the others also kind of ended up taking it because some of them knew what they wanted to do, and the others didn't know what they wanted to do. So I stumbled into IIM Ahmedabad and another 2 years there. But I think my questions further intensified there. So those were difficult years for me in terms of what I want to do with my life. What will all this amount to? I did my summers at IIM in a place which was a kind of a small NGO working in a village in Western UP. And I think that was as a result of some of the questions I had, that was an interesting and useful experience. Post IIM, I got a job in the US in management consulting and I landed up there. But I think in all this, while on the outside, life seems to be quite comfortable and quite fortunate, but on the inside, I think I was going through a lot of turmoil about what is it all about? Is there any purpose to life? What is my role towards the larger world, towards a better world? I think also at that age, when you're grappling with all this, sometimes you wonder if there's something wrong with you or something wrong with the world. So I went through all that. So I guess I came back from the US and decided to try out some things along social dimensions. And that's where I guess that's how I am where I am. So that's what it's been like.
You mentioned your inclination towards or these curious questions emerging about these social dimensions and the inequality in the society in general. But was there any aha moment, any moment that you saw it and you felt something is wrong here? Like, if I can change, you know what, let's do it.
Yeah, I think the question needs possibly two corrections. So, one, it is not an aha moment when you are struggling with this and getting disenchanted or disillusioned with the world. And two, I think it is not a moment. I think for most people who go through such things, it is definitely a period of a few years, I think, where you struggle, grapple, get to some part answers and stuff. So, in my case, like I mentioned, I think I had a very happy going, active, involved life till I was in IIT. But as soon as I started work, I don't know why these kind of questions popped up. Maybe, I don't know, one can just read a lot of things in retrospect. So my parents were first generation out of a village, and all our summer vacations were also spent in my grandparents' village. So I had lots of cousins who were growing up in the village. I sometimes wonder if I could see the difference between my life and their life, and that was a prod for me, or whatever, to see that how life situations can be so different just based on a small circumstance that my father studied and ended up taking a job in the city, and some of his other brothers were in the village, and my cousins of the same age, perhaps as good as me on any other count, had very different life chances purely because they were there. And this I'm talking about upper caste, upper class people in the village. They were not the bottom end of the village itself. There was a part to the village which. So I wonder if that exposure helped me see some things. I don't really know. But so when I started working, also, I kind of found a software job quite irrelevant to the larger issues in society. Fine, we could write some software, but it seemed as if one was doing nothing for what were the real things, the real questions in society. Maybe those were some things that troubled me. And in this whole search, when I did this summer, my I am summer thing at a village where some people were trying some kind of a slightly different experiment with the villages there and the school, I think some things kind of clicked for me there. So a lot of things which I thought I found amiss with the world in terms of our worldview, first of all. I mean, this whole pursuit of material things will lead to a better life, especially in the upper classes, was something that didn't make sense to me. But just because everyone was doing it, and when you are 21, 22, you wonder whether you are right or the world is right, like I said. So these questions for me, when I went to this experiment during my IIM summers, this experiment was based on some kind of a philosophy, actually, which talked about how humans can see their needs differently, how humans can see their relationship with respect to other humans differently. We need to recognize the cycles in nature when we talk of our economic, social system. So I think some of those things resonated with me. So I had these questions, but that body of thought kind of made me think that, yes, I am thinking in the right direction, even though bulk of the people and systems seem to be counter to what I'm thinking. So I think that was, in a sense, if I could say, not really an aha moment, but some kind of a reassurance that my questions are not completely unfounded.
And where does, how did the Sambhaavnaa Institute come into the picture, first of all? What is the motivation behind this whole journey with Sambhaavnaa?
So I think when you get onto this road less traveled, life is a mix of your intentions and some serendipity, I think. Sambhavna kind of happened to us because prior to Sambhavna, it was a bunch of us who were based in a village outside Bhopal, and we were trying some kind of a Gram Swaraj experiment. So we'd met in our own journey of questions and of trying to do something worthwhile, and we kind of concluded that you can't really fix this world. You have to create a new world. So I think when you're in your early 20s, you're audacious and naive both. So I think maybe they're two sides of the same coin. So it was a bunch of us who located ourselves in this village and kind of motivated by the same philosophy I mentioned that I had come across. We thought that maybe in about 20 years, we can create some kind of a model of self-sufficient, self-reliant communities, which can be some kind of an answer to the world. So it was actually some kind of a psychosocial change. So this thing was based on trying to make people question their assumptions about a good life, about their role in the world. So there's a personal transformation, psychological transformation dimension to this experiment. And we were hoping consequently, these communities of 20, 30, 40 villages maybe can create some kind of systems where they can take care of their own education, health, children can be there, etc. So that was something we wanted to try out. Of course, on the ground, we realized that it's one thing for people from an urban privileged background having existential questions, but ground realities in Indian villages are completely different. So, for example, just to start off with, we realized that the ownership of resources is so unequal that all this talk of some kind of a communitarian living doesn't really take off. Then caste comes into the picture. People's aspirations are very much glued to the same modern world that the urban people are living. So many things. So it's not that we were not aware of these things, but we still hoped that we would be able to make some dent. But once on the ground, we also realized that any kind of economic model, because everybody needs something to be viable. We had thought we'll work on organic farming, small scale production. None of that really works in the larger capitalist world that we are living in. So as we started seeing some of the limitations of what we were hoping to do, I also started reading up on economics, on economic history, on models of development. So when we had folded that experiment, we were looking for other places to engage with. And because of my own kind of inclination on this whole questioning this whole model of development, Sambhaavnaa also had a similar thought. So the people who kind of started off Sambhaavnaa were coming from these people's movements of the 90s and early 2000s. And they were also coming from a bent where this whole model of development was something that ought to be questioned. And this kind of a thing, this kind of a, let's say, critical thinking be disseminated in youth. So I think somewhere that's where our goals kind of matched, and we got onto this journey of designing programs for youth, for young activists around basically political education, economic education, social education, whatever you might call them. That's how Sambhaavnaa kind of happened.
So I've been super lucky to be a part of one of Sambhaavnaa's workshop, and that is Nayi Dishai, a summer school on rethinking development. What was the motivation behind creating this specific workshop?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, so we had been working on the ground for about 10 years by then. And on the ground, we discovered these issues of, say, poverty, for example. And when you would read up, you would realize that the country has enough food grains, but there are still people who are hungry. Or there was a complete lack of jobs, because jobs are the most primary thing that can possibly offer people some kind of dignified living. Or if you go further, look at the ecological devastation that was happening because of the lifestyles of the rich, so to say. Even a complete capture of our democracies, I mean, the kind of legislations being made, how corporates are kind of running the world. So I'm talking about a period of, this is happening between 2000 and 2010 for us. So, and in my own trying to understand economics and whatever we kind of learned on the ground, it became quite evident that the official answer to all these problems is that countries like India have to develop. And there's a certain model of development that is being offered by the government and, of course, by international agencies and all. And this development, basically, if one were to say, was saying that if you have economic growth, if you increase production, basically there'll be well-being for people. But if you were to study what was happening, and if you study the fact that this kind of a model of development had an underlying capitalist engine, then anyway, this question of jobs for all, food for all, removal of poverty, living in harmony with the ecology, governments being able to function without corporate interference, it clearly looked impossible. So basically, we could see that what is being put forth as a solution is actually the problem. In fact, it has systemic problems. So somewhere we had to interrogate this model of development, which is why I think this program kind of, so it was born out of our own learnings on the ground, born out of an understanding of what economic theory was saying, but what was actually coming out in practice. So we thought that this has to be decrypted, demystified, उसका पर्दाफाश करना जरूरी है, ऐसा हमको उस वक्त लगा था, and which was also the inclination of the institute in a sense. So this was one of the earlier flagship programs to do with youth that we designed. I think that is kind of the history.
I A little pushback from my side. So capitalism, I think you mentioned capitalism has certain inherent issues, right? But most liberal societies in the current world function on capitalism, the economic model of capitalism.
True.
And it seems like, at least it seems like on the surface, that over the past 200 years, especially over the past 50 years, so to speak, there's been like a material abundance and an increase in standard of living, a relative amount of freedom as well. In light of all this, I guess I have two questions. The first is, how would you explain capitalism as a concept to a layman? Right? That's the first. And the second is, what is inherently wrong with this concept of capitalism?
Yeah, so if I go to your question saying, what is capitalism? I think the big difference is that social economic systems before capitalism basically in some ways are producing what people needed. Whereas in capitalism, the big shift is that everything starts getting determined by the metric of profit. So basically, only that will be produced which can get you profit. So basically, producers will be producing for people who have purchasing power and not necessarily producing for people's needs. Which is why if you look in a country like India, where half the houses don't have toilets, we are selling over 3 lakh cars a month, for example. So one big problem is that when everything is determined by the metric of profit, an economic system ought to serve many functions. For example, people should have dignified jobs. Capitalism would not be interested in producing jobs. If it can profit, those jobs might happen. Otherwise, it is under no obligation to produce jobs. An economic system also ought to ensure that we don't disrupt ecological cycles, we don't create potential. But if you can profit by polluting the environment, if you can profit by using resources which are beyond your geographical boundaries, whatever, I mean, if you can get cheaper labor, so all those kind of dysfunctionalities come into capitalism for two reasons. One is this driving thing about profit, and the second is that it operates in an environment of competing producers. So there are also, so I mean, the way Adam Smith puts competition, he puts competition in a very benign and nice regulating role, as if people who are not able to produce at a certain cost will get knocked out. But in real life, people don't lose so gracefully and walk out because your survival depends on it. So which is why we see that this kind of a competitive environment actually creates ground for unscrupulous means, for getting legislation that is favorable to you, for possibly externalizing cost in terms of. So these are some of the fault lines in capitalism that one needs to think of. I think maybe we'll talk more about it later.
Like in your answer, there were certain really interesting points. One of them was around individuals, how capitalism enables individual mobility, but the inherent issues in capitalism looked like systemic issues, right? Societal issues. One rebuttal to some extent would be someone like the shareholder theory by Milton Friedman. Just to phrase it, Milton Friedman, who's a famous economist, theorized this line saying that an entity's greatest responsibility lies in the satisfaction of the shareholders. What it essentially means is, if you're an investor in a company, the company's main core responsibility is to make the investor happy. That gives some power to the investor, or almost democratizes certain amount of decisions to the investor. What are the pros and cons of such a system? Because this seems to be, again, another feature of capitalism to some extent in the current scheme of things.
Yeah, so I'll come to this in a minute, but taking off from that other point you mentioned that about capitalism enables mobility. So I think what I missed mentioning that yes, compared to a feudal system where probably the system worked for 0.1% of the population, capitalism today probably works for 10% of the planet. So in that sense, it can seem like mobility. But I would say we should also look at the socialist experiments of the 20th century. So I think if we were to talk of real social mobility, at least social economic mobility, those systems fared much better than capitalist systems. So for large parts of the population, you had education, healthcare, housing, and it's completely, I mean, it's a valid point that in terms of civil political rights, those systems had real big problems. But I'm just wanting to say that when we talk of social mobility compared to a feudal system, while capitalism might have achieved some success, perhaps the socialist experiments had much more. So that was just a thought that crossed my mind.
Yeah.
But now coming to Mr. Friedman, Mr. Friedman, wherever he must be a happy man, because at least over the last 40 years, his kind of economics has reigned supreme over the planet. Of course, much to, I would say, to our bad luck or whatever. But if you were to, I mean, the fact that he says that it's only the shareholder to whom a firm should be responsible, I don't think it takes too much, especially in today's world, for us to see that it is actually a very one-sided theory. For example, shareholder value can go up if you can pollute a river and produce something at a cheaper cost. Shareholder value can go up if you pull your factory out of India and put it in Cambodia or Bangladesh or something. Shareholder value can come up if the Vietnam government decides to give you lesser tax and in the process harm its own people. So in today's world, there are many ways by which the profit of a company can go up at the cost of harming society. So I think what Mr. Friedman is missing is we are not just consumers, we are also citizens to whom the environmental. So if you have toxic air and you have the fanciest of cars or the best of malls, it affects you. Similarly, we are also parents, we are also family members, we are also neighbors. So if the profit and the low cost that Mr. Friedman is promising to a consumer comes at the cost of harming our lives as citizens, our lives as parents, you can see that it's a very one-sided measure. In fact, even mainstream economic theory has moved much beyond Mr. Friedman and it talks of all these triple bottom lines and all still very mainstream, but even they talk of profits, people, and the planet, at least lip service, if not really. So Mr. Friedman is definitely outdated, though he reigns supreme in today's world. But I think it doesn't take much to see through that if a corporation responds only to shareholders, we will be left poorer on many other much more relevant counts.
You very briefly touched upon economic inequality. India ranks 129, I suppose, out of 190 countries. What is the reason for such incredulous inequality, such social despair, such social divide between the different income stratas of India?
True. Actually, the short answer to that will be very simple. So one, all of us, like you yourself said, most countries are now capitalist, broadly capitalist economies. And most of these countries have kind of started from a feudal background. So we've moved to capitalism largely from feudal kind of systems. So feudal systems had high inequality to start off with. So it was only a few people who owned most of the resources. Bulk of them did not. On this comes capitalism, which basically, if I were to define capitalism in one line, one way to define it could be, it is a system in which wealth begets wealth. So if you have money, it's easier to make money. So if you start off from a system which is unequal and you move to a system in which those who have money, those who have better starting points can do much better than the others, the inequality will only widen. So that is basically the theoretical reason why we are where we are in the world. On this also, I think if you just look at India's economic history, you can see some interesting things. So I think we can look at India's post-economic history in two phases. There was a phase between 1947 to 90, which we know we had a slightly different kind of economic policies, where the state had a much bigger role, both in planning, in actually ownership of a lot of heavy industry, etc. And post 1990, we moved to a much more free market kind of a model where the state has much lesser role in economic activity. And this has happened across the world. So actually, if you look at inequality data between 1950 and 1990, inequality actually went down in the country. So when you had a very active state looking at redistribution, etc., inequality was going down. There were problems with that model, etc. But I'm saying And after 1990, when we have this unleashed, this kind of an unbridled version of capitalism, where new economic theory is basically telling us don't tax the rich, leave the money in the hands of the rich. This is when inequality has gone up much more sharply. So I think it's basically an unequal starting point, and then a system where it's easier for the rich to make more money. That automatically leads to this widening gap, basically, across the world and also in India.
But a big selling point of capitalism, as far as discussions or for someone who's a pro-capitalist would say, uh, wealth trickles down.
Mm-hmm.
Capital with the rich sort of trickles down to everyone in this cycle or in this sphere of, let's say, you are creating an industry, creating some sort of product, the fruits kind of trickle down to everyone in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a like fallacy, or it does not reflect in the real world?
No, that's a very important myth to kind of demystify and all. So you're right that wealth trickles down. I also said that over the last 200 years, as the world has kind of turned capitalist, material consumption levels have gone up. Like we were saying that each generation over the last 3 or 4 generations in the country, it is empirically possible to prove that the sons and the daughters were consuming more than their parents and so on. So there is definitely a downward diffusion of consumer goods, etc., in capitalism, simply because production is going up. So the net production is going up. Everybody is getting some share. It is true that the upper classes are getting a larger share, and therefore inequality is happening. But I think the problem with this model is that we need to understand this concept of absolute poverty and relative poverty. So absolute poverty means that, for example, if you were to put a benchmark saying how many Indians were earning less than 100 rupees a day in 1980, that percentage would, and if you look at the same number of people earning less than 100 rupees in 2020, I'm saying we adjust the 100 for inflation,
Yes.
the number would go down. True. So you can say that absolute poverty has gone down. So if you put 100 as a mark of poverty, but I think there is also another concept of relative poverty, which means that the bottom 10% of the population, their income compared to the top 10%, if this ratio has really gone up, then today I will say that the bottom 10% ends up feeling poorer in the society they live. So there is also a psychological dimension to it, and society also reshapes itself to start delivering goods, services. So your sense of self-worth, your sense of self-esteem, whether you are a person who's successful or not in society, this perception really changes. So, which is why I think inequality and relative poverty are kind of related things. For human beings who are primarily psychological beings, it is very important to not. So this business that it's trickling down, and why don't you see that even your guard or your maid now has a cell phone, is actually, I feel, a very, if not just incorrect, I think it's a dangerous kind of logic which we need to see through. So that would be my take on that.
This is the really eye-opening, truly eye-opening. Like continuing with this thread, right, of consumption, it seems like we as humans are in, like, just naturally speaking, are increasing our consumption with time. We consume more and more. Just normal people like you and I, right? Consume more food, clothing, shelter, whatever may be the environmental situation.
True.
But we are also regularly told that resources are limited in the world. There are just limited resources, and it looks like we are increasing consumption. How can this paradox be resolved? Like, it seems to be like two opposing powers pulling against each other.
Mm-hmm.
Is this going to continue? If it continues, what is going to happen? It seems to be nebulous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so the way I see it, I think there are two problems in the way we live. One is our worldview per se, which is about, we believe that the more material things we have, we will have a happier life, a better life. So there is a problem with our worldview itself where we have not really understood our needs. I think that we have two kinds of needs. We have material needs and we have psychological needs. Psychological needs like love, belonging, a sense of self-worth, a sense of contribution to society, what are possibly the higher order needs on the Maslow's hierarchy, for example. I think humans have not figured good ways to meet the higher order needs, and we are trying to fulfill these needs via material consumption. So that is one reason that we continue to have a maybe we don't feel fulfilled, maybe we don't have self-esteem, we don't have self-worth, but we try and fill it with perhaps a bigger house, a bigger car. That is one driver why humanity seems to be yearning more consumption. But I feel this is compounded in our system by an economic system which also needs to continuously sell more. So
Hmm.
capitalism, as they say, can sell anything, but it can't sell less. So it is actually capitalizing on this problem of ours that we as unfulfilled individuals are seeking fulfillment, and the system wants to sell more. So if you look at most of our ads, I mean, a motorcycle ad would be selling freedom. The Airtel ad would be selling connection and belonging. So this increase in consumption is coming from two fault lines: a faulty economic system, and I will say a faulty worldview. And absolutely correct that the planet has finite resources. So it can't go on like this. I think we need to kind of sort both these quandaries if we really need to move towards a world with balanced consumption or ecological harmony. So we also, as individuals, need some elements of what could be called a shift in consciousness or personal transformation, where we are able to differentiate between our material and psychological needs. And once we because psychological needs are not to be fulfilled by material things. If we were to find real sources of self-esteem, self-worth, contribution to the world, automatically our material needs will right size. So that is one part. But of course, we need to also fix the economic system. Otherwise, in some way or the other, it will try to push us into consumption, whether it's through advertisements or through ads. One of my favorite jokes is also like that earlier there used to be two kinds of people, the haves and the have nots. And now we have the haves, the have nots, and the have not paid for what they have. So if you look at capitalism, it's not just advertisements, but this whole debt based selling is also a kind of a. So I think I would say that we can't sort out this resource problem, this problem of trying to live within a finite planet, unless we address both these fault lines. That would be my take.
Has there ever been a society with fulfilled psychological needs? I guess my question is, there is certain like just on a scientific level, there can be certain assumption, right? A psychological need, when met, will reduce need for consumption. And I guess because I'm very benchmark oriented, right? If there is a society that has shown this fulfilled psychological need, then we can go and study, we can understand that better. Is there
Hmm.
any example to go to further your claim, to further this point?
So, one, I'm not like a super historian, nor do I think history has really been able to. I mean, beyond a certain point, we would not have records of certain societies. I don't know if there would ever have been societies like that, but I feel that to some extent, the thing that I'm talking about, we can see it in individuals around us. So it is possible that in some societies, we had a larger share of the population, which I'm just like guessing now here. It's all up in the air in that sense. But I feel we can see individuals whose material needs seem to be much more regulated and in control, perhaps because they have other better, let's say, larger sources of fulfillment in their lives, on terms of whether feeling a sense of belonging, affection, love, sense of meaning, self esteem. I think those are perhaps the best we can use as some kind of validators of the kind of hypothesis I'm putting forth.
We most free societies live in a democratic system. democracy, I suppose, is a governance system and capitalism is an economic system. And these two worlds or these two ideas seem to coexist on the surface, at least in most free liberal societies. But can it coexist in a healthy fashion? Like if capitalism is so all consuming, can capitalism and democracy live or coexist healthily?
Yeah, that's a good question between democracy and capitalism, because the mainstream liberal thought basically says that the final endpoint of humanity is democratic political systems and a capitalist economic system. But if you look at it, I feel that there is an inherent complete paradox between these two systems. So democracy is inherently about equality. And one could argue in a very purist sense that it is only about equality of political and civil rights and not really economic inequality. But I think that would be a very superficial argument. In spirit, democracy is about equality. It's about equal dignity to all people. It's about the right for all of us to be able to take decisions that matter in our lives. So the moment you have capitalism as an economic system, some of these things get eroded. Firstly, capitalism inherently does not care about equality. It is a system that is working for profit. But the competitive pressures in capitalism actually end up basically making corporates buy out democracies, as we are seeing everywhere. So they buy out legislation, they will buy out politicians, they will kind of buy out democracy itself. And so if you have a system in which producers are competing to stay afloat, they will look for all possible ways to ensure their survival. And one of the things that falls is because the state ideally is supposed to regulate capitalism. So you try to undo that by buying legislation, by buying politicians. And unfortunately, this electoral democracy where political parties need to fight elections, the problem is they also need money to fight elections. So there is some kind of a dovetailing that happens. So because there is a need for political, I mean, of course, we can organize elections in ways where elections are state funded and we regulate how money, but currently the way it is organized, political parties need money and this money comes in return for favorable legislation, etc., which gets, so that I think is a big kind of problem between capitalism and democracy. In fact, I'll share another of my favorite quips. So Chomsky said this, that democracy and capitalism can't coexist.
Noam Chomsky, right?
Yeah,
Noam Chomsky is a very famous linguist, I suppose.
Right. He's a public intellectual. So, and I joke in my classes that you don't need to be a Chomsky to see that democracy and capitalism can't coexist. So.
There is one basic pushback would be this idea of equality, right? This idea of equality, a lot of people would push back the idea of equality as equality of opportunity. It need not be just blanket equality, right? And in an completely equal society where everyone owns equal, everyone has equal amount of money, the question would be lack of motivation. Like this idea of motivation. Because there is upward mobility, it motivates you. There's this dopamine rush, testosterone. No, I need to achieve more,
Yeah.
What is your take on this idea of equality of opportunity giving you this ability to move ahead? And in a truly equal, egalitarian society, would it not stifle this need to push further, to innovate?
Yeah, so what you're saying is actually what mainstream economic theory says, and that is their assumption about human nature and human beings. So, see, if you can ensure a true equality of opportunity, I think that itself is a great starting point. But most of us are not even aware about the realities of our society. So, for example, we don't have good functioning educational systems or schools all across the country, right? So what equality of opportunity are we talking about? And even if you were to say, for example, ensure that everyone has the right schooling, somebody who's coming from a Dalit family, the way they get treated in a classroom, the possibility of the teacher kind of behaving with them in a discriminatory way, even that exactly same kind of schools are still not ensuring an equality of opportunities. So I can theoretically agree that equality of opportunity is a good way to start, but we need to really see the nuances of, can we really even provide that? That would be one answer. I mean, if that's an answer of any kind on the equality of opportunity thing that you said. But on the other one, where you say that if we had an equal society, why will people be motivated to even move forward? I would again say that I think we have a very dim view of human nature if we were to see human beings like this. We are assuming that human beings only want to do well, to do better than someone else, to outcompete someone else. That is again what I'm saying. We believe that it's either some kind of greed or lure or some kind of fear that motivates human beings. I think these are actually very suboptimal and poor motivators. We can see human beings all around us who are motivated by something completely different. There is a desire to just do something well, there's a desire to contribute. So it's not that we are only motivated if we can beat someone else or if I can be better than the other. So my answer to that one would be that this understanding, both in economic theory and some sections of psychology, is a very poor understanding of the human being. And again, like I was saying, in the case of the psychological and material needs, we can see this in people around us. We can even see it in ourselves.
Yes.
So sometimes we also need to question a lot of the assumptions in dominant economic theory or social science, that is this really how I am? Is this really how people around me are? And I think we will be able to see through the limitations of some of those things, basically.
I agree. This is a very profound idea itself. I also want to just to make sure, like, people really need to. I'll put the link down to Sambhaavnaa's website, because going for this workshop was really eye-opening for me personally, like on an intellectual level. One part of the program, we dealt into the idea of the role of government, the role of government in a democracy, let alone a capitalist democracy. Could you elaborate on this idea of government and its role, the role that it plays in any sort of free society?
Yeah, so one remark first, while it might be flattering to hear that you enjoyed the program, I think it is also coming from a certain recency, and you might be overestimating the impact of the program on you, in the sense that, yes, it's a good place for young people to be together and think about many issues, but it shouldn't give an impression that it's like some grand magic that we do. And so I'm just kind of
I'll push
right-sizing
back on that.
expectations.
I will push back on that. Like,
Yeah, you
again,
can, but I'm only right-sizing expectations for anyone who's possibly going to hear this podcast. Yeah, so I think, see, one way to look at the role of the government is that there is this belief that capitalism needs to be regulated, and that is the role of the government, right? So capitalism has its excesses, and the government should be basically, so if the government were to do a good job at regulation, then capitalism is an all positive kind of system. So in theory, while that might be a proposition, like we've just spoken, that because there is so much economic power, once the way capitalism operates, there is also a concentration of both corporate power and money power. So in any industry across the world, you could see that maybe 3 or 4 players have 70% of the market share. So inherently, capitalism leads to a concentration, a centralization of economic power, of production. So how it actually pans out in practice is, like we've seen, that the politicians and the government also needs money, and the corporates have money, and they use this money effectively to blunt out the possibilities of regulation. And in fact, now if you see what is called neoclassical economic theory, or what is neoliberalism, the dominant economic theory over the last 40 years, even the theory is saying that you should not be taxing the rich, you should leave the money in the hands of the rich. And so whatever possible redistributory role a state could have played, which used to happen in some of the successful social democracies, is being undermined by theory itself. So whether it is buying up of legislation to just work in the favor of corporates or to remove the possibility of the state having some kind of a redistributory, equalizing kind of a role that is going away. So in that sense, I think, in fact, and not only that, in the new regime where we have this international kind of a porous capitalist global order, governments are increasingly powerless in their countries. So, like, you can't even make legislation because there's a larger capitalist world order of the WTO, IMF, etc. To use more fancy terminology, I would say that political jurisdictions and economic jurisdictions don't overlap anymore. So the government of India doesn't really have as much economic power over the jurisdiction of India as it had, say, 40 years back. So all these are implications of how governments are ideally supposed to have a certain role of balancing, of equalizing, of doing good for their larger population, but how capitalism undermines all this and renders governments increasingly powerless to do real good for their people. I would say, I would put it that way, actually.
If we were to flip the script a little bit, you mentioned power, the word power. We've seen in history when governments, when the state has power over redistribution, how that can go haywire. A recent example is Lebanon. So Lebanon, for its early, for like around 20 years, the government was like the redistributing factor, and they had control over the central banks, even the private banks, and they had a lot of, essentially they had a lot of power, and they misused, and corruption was pretty much a blanket statement there. Do you think centralizing power to the government again has an inherent flaw, which you could call it a feature in its own way, right? A socialist system. The government would misuse it. And capitalism, even though there are examples of 70% like monopolization, there is like a decentralization of power, which has its own flaws. But do you think if you flip the switch, you'd still get a very similar outcome?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I don't know much about Lebanon, but that question can be seen in the context of the socialist experiments of the 20th century. So whether it was the USSR or China, they basically looked for a more equal society, a redistribution that was led by the state. And we also know that that came. So instead of economic power being concentrated, these experiments have a history of political power being concentrated and people's political and civil rights completely being smothered. So you're right that as long as we have some kind of a centralized entity that is not accountable, that you can't question, that you can't change, I think we will end up with similar outcomes or maybe even worse outcomes in some cases. So while there needs to be an equality in society in terms of material outcomes, possibilities, etc., I think if I were to use a phrase that might not be appreciated, we need to look for, I will say, more democratic versions of socialism. So how can we have these questions of how will our lives run? How will we have relatively similar outcomes, equality? How do we decide all this also collectively and in a very decentralized manner? So while socialism is a bad word in today's day and age, I think having learned from the experiments of the 20th century and now having seen the capitalist onslaught for 40 years, we need to think of better economic systems, but equally importantly, political systems in which real participation, a real decentralization is also possible. I would say, I mean, if that is any kind of an answer to your question.
No,
yes, I agree that concentrating political power does not solve the question of concentrated economic power. That's as bad or if not worse in some cases.
Yep. I think that makes complete sense. It's a very nuanced take itself, right? Now that these are all, I think, experiments that we are conducting on a very global scale.
Yeah, I think there are people. So I sometimes feel academic thought is often a little ahead of, or actually often sometimes quite ahead of practice. So there are many people who are writing on things like, in fact, there is a phrase called democratic eco-socialism also. So that's the third dimension we need to get into. So if you're talking of a new world, a new society, not only do we need to look at economic systems which are fair and equal, and look at political systems that are truly participatory, but we need to look at also the ecological dimension, that all this is in a manner that we don't kind of run out of the limits of the planet, so to say.
There's a very interesting role that privilege plays. And this is another thing that came up in the course, in the workshop.
Mm-hmm.
So, just in layman terms, what is this idea of privilege and how it impacts all our lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so one example could be that you can probably walk out of your house wearing shorts, but your sister might have to think twice if she walks out anyway wearing shorts, right? So that is basically what I will call male privilege. Or you could go out looking for a house in Delhi, rent a rental place. But if you're a Muslim today looking out for a house, they might face something completely different. So just by a matter of privilege, or what does it mean today to be a Dalit student in a university versus being an upper caste student? So these are basically examples of privilege. So one way to define it would be that if you look at the male, or if you look at the Hindu upper caste person looking for a house in Delhi compared to a Muslim, or if you look at a non-Dalit student, they have access to some kind of a resource, a status, a position which has come to them completely by chance. So it's an unearned thing that they have purely by access to a particular social group, right? If you're a male, you can walk out wearing shorts. If you're a non-Muslim looking for a house, you don't need to be aware. So this is what privilege is, that it is some rights, some freedoms, some resources which are accessible or available only to a few people purely by chance. And those that don't have it can do nothing to undo it. I mean, I can't do anything if I'm born in a Muslim family. I can't do anything to undo. So this idea is important to understand when we look at, especially at Indian society, and when we talk of a better world. So I think this is one thing we try to bring out in the program more, because, I mean, if I were to give you another example. So for example, one could think that most of the people who matter today in India, who are taking important decisions, are in places of higher up in the bureaucracy, in judiciary, in politics. Let's say they are over 45 years of age or over 40 years of age today. Now, most of these people are likely to be college educated, right? The high bureaucracy. If you look at, so somebody who's 40 or 45 today went to college in, say, 2000, right? And in the year 2000, what is called the gross enrollment ratio, or the proportion of population that should be going to college and is actually going to college. Would you have any idea what that was in India in 2000, for example? So like 10% of Indians went to college in 2000. So imagine that people who are currently in all these important places come from that top 10% of Indian society. Even today, only about 26-27% of India is going to colleges, like people who should be in college. So even the next 20. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the viewpoint, the worldviews, the life experiences of people in power is coming from that small, privileged, upper class, upper caste kind of a situation. So for such people, when they are taking decisions about society, when they are thinking about the future of the country, it is so important to know that the life of a villager, or the life of a Dalit, or the life of a woman, or the life of a woman Adivasi. So I think this idea of privilege tries to open our eyes to lives and life experiences we are really far away from. I think that is one. So this program largely that we do with youth and many other programs are essentially about interrogating the idea of development, trying to look at our society. So privilege, I think, helps you look at some of these things. And one or two things I'll add again. I mean, I can keep thinking and talking about all this. Unless we understand privilege, I think there are two big problems. One, we develop prejudices. So for example, it's quite common for richer people to believe the poor are poor because they don't work hard. So that's a very natural prejudice to have. But it's coming from the fact that we don't understand the life. Like I said, remember that I went to a good school in the 70s and 80s. But what does it mean for a cousin of mine who lives in a village? Does he even have access to school? Forget a cousin of mine, forget a person in a Dalit family, even if they access the school, how are they treated in school? And the fact that that Dalit kid has to go back and also fetch water and perhaps also raise their younger sibling compared to a slightly privileged person like my cousin who could at least when they come back could study, and somebody like me who has like electricity and everything. So one is that if we don't see our privilege, we have these prejudices that shape our worldview, our decisions. Two, I think the other thing is we have this delusion of merit. So people like us believe that we are successful because I studied hard and I am a hardworking. So it's my merit that has got me where I am. But you might have worked hard, but unless you see those so many things that were stacked in your favor, you tend to overvalue your hard work and merit. And again, like develop another prejudice that people who are not successful today or haven't landed up where I have, it's because they didn't deserve it. They didn't work hard. So this delusion of merit, this formation of prejudices, I think the idea of privilege helps us sometimes see through all that.
It puts into perspective, like a simple thing like me growing up in a family and in an English speaking family.
Absolutely.
The advantages are intangible for that matter.
Absolutely. I mean, if I also look back, while my own parents were first generation out of a village, but the fact that we got an English newspaper in the house could have made such a big difference to my life. I mean, not that I was a very regular English reader or something, but just the presence of those things, the fact that you can actually have 15 storybooks on your bookshelves. How many Indian families have some of these things? So all those things make a difference.
A lot of discussions have happened, a lot of information we both of us have shared. What are the 3 books that you'd recommend our viewers to check out?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, they keep changing. So because we've been talking about development and all that, let me try and think of one or two. So there's a recent one I read called The Divide, A Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions or something by Jason Hickel. I think that's a good book to read because it also gives the long history of development. It's quite a readable book. Then again, talking of economics and all, I think anything by Robert Heilbronner is good, but one of his oldest books called The Worldly Philosophers, it's a very readable, nice book on the history of economic thought if someone is interested. I think there's a book by Professor C.T. Kurian called The Economy, an Interpretative Introduction. It's very difficult to find because it's gone out of print, but I think that's a very good way to look at economic systems and economic history. So given the kind of conversation we had, I think these 3 books I'll recommend.
Or I'll put the links in the description so that people can check it out. I think a lot of viewers are young, are making decisions with respect to their careers. And one thing that talking to young folks, it seems to be pretty clear that they are more impact driven. They want to make an impact in the society. What advice would you give to someone who who wants to make an impact in the world through their professional life, through the time that they are going to spend now? You're going to spend almost 80% of your waking hours working. What advice would you give a young teenager who's about to make that decision?
So one, I think I have no right to give any advice because I'm still myself grappling with those questions, having lived more than 50 years. So I don't think I have advice really, but I think I would say 2 things. One is I think if there's a way to be more empathetic, I think that is one thing that is one aspect I would think. I don't know how one can become more empathetic. Maybe one can become aware, and at a personal level, I would say that. But when it comes to work, like your question is, what do they do with their career and work or something? I think my 2 pence on this is that, of course, we need a certain level of material comfort. खाने पीने का तो होना ही चाहिए basic level पे. But मुझे लगता है कि fulfillment or true some sense of meaning comes to if we are able to contribute to the world. So I think we should look for work which gives us that this is of some relevance and makes some meaningful contribution to the world. So I think that would be that money or what is considered to be a prestigious, famous kind of a situation or place to get into should not be our only driver. Of course, we need to fend for ourselves. You need to have whatever work you do should take care of your material needs. But that dimension is what will really make us happy, fulfilled, actually happier human beings, perhaps. So if we can look for that element in our work, what is the contribution or role of this towards making a better world, if I were to use lofty language, that could be an approach or a way to look at one's life. That is all I would say. I mean, despite all that, it's not easy to find. We'll struggle, we'll stumble, but that's okay. I think that's part of it.
I think that's about it. This conversation has been so illuminating. I hope people watch it till the end. This is the one thing I wish. I hope people watch it. I hope people share it with others who, like friends, family members, because it has been such an illuminating, such a open conversation, such a interesting discussion, and this is just a morsel of what the education that I received in Sambhaavnaa. The Because we just had an hour or so to discuss this, but this is the 12-day program, and there are a lot of topics that we could cover, and it's again very in a very diverse approach, right? It's not just about lectures. The backdrop you're seeing is the classroom there, so it's really interesting after some time to see the classroom, but also activities. There are other approaches to education itself. So, but thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are. You're taking the time.
Thank you, Richard. We don't need to get into all that. It's been a pleasure for me as well. I think so.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye, Richard. Thank you. Bye.